Today we're going to talk about the Republican Party's final attempt in Congress to reject the election results, what's at stake in this week's Senate runoff in Georgia, and my interview with former South Carolina Senate candidate Jamie Harrison, who's been on the campaign trail for Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, where we talk about whether the GOP's opposition to relief checks is having an impact in the race in Georgia, and some really promising news about the turnout there. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen, and you're listening to No Lie. So we finally arrived at the final stage in the Republican Party's sustained temper tantrum, where, as of this recording, about a dozen Republican senators and 140 Republican lawmakers have announced that they'll vote on January 6th to reject the electors from certain states. The senators released a statement that had demanded a 10-day audit of election returns in states that they've arbitrarily decided are disputed. And I'm not going to read all of the statement for our own sanity, but here are a few lines that basically form the crux of their argument. They wrote, quote, "The 2020 election featured unprecedented allegations of voter fraud, violations, and lax enforcement of election law and other voting irregularities. Voter fraud had posed a persistent challenge in our elections, although its breadth and scope are disputed. By any measure, the allegations of fraud and irregularities in the 2020 election exceed any in our lifetimes, and those allegations are not just believed by one individual candidate, instead they are widespread. Polling, tragically, shows that 39% of all Americans believed the election was rigged. That belief is held by 67% of Republicans, 17% of Democrats, and 31% of independents. Some members of Congress disagree with that assessment, as do members of the media, but whether or not our elected officials or journalists believe it, that deep distrust of our democratic process will not magically disappear. It should concern us all, and it poses an ongoing threat to the legitimacy of any subsequent administrations." And they go on to claim that there's precedent for this charade, and that precedent, I kid you not, is from 1877. Like, really compelling stuff. I don't see how we can just pretend that the Hayes-Tilden presidential race never happened. Okay, so the point that I want to make from that paragraph is that they cite the statistic that 39% of Americans believe the election was rigged as if that's proof that the election was rigged. But here's the thing. They believe the election was rigged because Republicans keep saying it was rigged. The GOP has spent months telling people the election was stolen, and now they're literally citing the fact that people believe them as their evidence. This is one of the most obvious schemes. They think they can manifest this conspiracy theory into reality by pointing to how many people believe the conspiracy theory. That's not proof anything was rigged. That's proof that the GOP is engaged in a disinformation campaign and they've brainwashed people into thinking there was fraud despite there being no evidence of fraud. Polling doesn't prove fraud. Proof of fraud proves fraud. And I don't think I need to tell anyone this, but there is no proof of fraud. Not in any of the 60 cases that were taken to court, not according to the DOJ, DHS, Republican governors, Republican secretaries of state, voting systems companies, no one. So I want to make one thing clear and assuage any fears. This won't have any material impact on the election. In order for a state's presidential vote to be thrown out, a majority in each chamber has to agree to the objection. Democrats hold the majority in the House, so that's already done. And even though Republicans have a slim majority in the Senate, a number of Republican senators have already come out against the charade. The worst case is that there can be up to 2 hours of debate to each state's results before members vote. So January 6th will be long, it'll be annoying, and we'll have the privilege of watching the Republican Party devolve yet further down this authoritarian rabbit hole as part of their lunge to the far right. But Donald Trump will leave office on January 20th. What this is, in reality, is a bunch of different people all undermining democracy with the ultimate goal of helping themselves. Trump's goal is obvious. He's trying to stay in office. Meanwhile, Josh Hawley, who was the first Republican senator to announce that he'd object on January 6th, he's clearly running for president in 2024. Same with Ted Cruz, who's quote-unquote leading a faction of 11 GOP senators to call for an emergency 10-day audit. The rest of them are clearly trying to curry favor with Trump and his base, to raise their profiles, whatever. But the through line is that they're all looking out for themselves, and they're doing it at the expense of our democracy. And I mean, just think about that for a second. The people jockeying to lead the country on the right are doing so by most loudly trying to destroy its foundation. And to think these people ever invoked, like, the Constitution and the Founding Fathers and the rule of law, when clearly none of those things matter. It was only ever about their own ambition. They're not running to protect the Constitution, they're running in spite of it. So look, I know that there's some people who think Biden's going to take office and it's just going to snap back to pre-Obama days. But if this is the GOP before Biden even takes office, if this is how they're trying to position themselves for 2024 now, do you really think it's going to get better? Do you really think the goal here is bipartisanship, working to govern for the people? No, it's going to be virtue signaling and bad faith attacks and undermining trust in our systems so that they can hopefully exploit those systems when they run for president. And I know that Biden's whole thing is that he'll come in and get Republicans to work with him. And I mean, look, do I hope that's the case? Absolutely. But my personal opinion is that it's naive to think that these people who are openly, proudly broadcasting their utter contempt for democracy are interested in anything other than selling their own little brands of Trumpism for the next 4 years so that they themselves can become president. It's not about helping anyone or fixing anything or governing. It is about holding power, period. And by the way, this is a party-wide phenomenon. The GOP isn't even pretending anymore to stand for anything. Like, I don't think I've been shy about how Democrats have a pretty serious messaging problem, but in the last few months, I don't think you could have a clear indication that while one party is trying to govern, the other party has been solely focused on baseless temper tantrums and fear-mongering about strawmen. Here's a clip from a debate that I had with Tommy Lahren a couple weeks ago on Fox LA's political show called The Issue Is, hosted by my friend Alex Michelson. I think this should pretty clearly explain the difference in both parties' agendas.
Georgia runoff, a lot at stake there. It's going to determine control of the Senate. Big picture, what's the biggest difference for the country if there's a Democratic control versus Republican control? Brian, quick take to you.
Sure. If Democrats control the Senate, guarantee you the first order of business is going to be relief to the American people, stimulus checks, $15 minimum wage, federally decriminalized marijuana, expanded access to health care, which is especially important now with this pandemic, and codifying protections for women's reproductive rights, which I know Tommy supports, even if she advocates for a party that is actively trying to strip her of those rights.
Tommy, biggest difference if Republicans stay in control?
If Republicans stay in control, then we are able to keep socialism from knocking on our door. I mean, it's still going to be a fight, but at least if we maintain control of the Senate, at least we can keep socialism pushed back.
So I think I was pretty clear about the fact that what we're fighting for on the left are things that, I believe will have a pretty decisive impact on people's lives. And all Tommy could muster with regard to why Republicans should be in charge is, socialism. That's it. It's the same tired fear-mongering that we've heard for years. But the reason that Republicans have to scare their voters is because they don't actually have an agenda that's worth promoting. What are they going to say? Vote for us and we'll give millionaires and billionaires a tax cut? We'll strip women of their reproductive rights? We'll make sure you don't get relief checks amid the pandemic that we helped exacerbate because we don't believe in science? Of course not. They can't say that. So instead, they'll just fearmonger and warn about socialism and Marxism and communism and migrant caravans and rapists and drugs and wars on Christmas and Christianity. It is demagoguery. Watch an hour of Fox News or OAN or Newsmax and come back and tell me something that the GOP stands for that isn't fighting back against imaginary wars with the left that the left didn't even know it was fighting. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the Senate runoff in Georgia. Because, at the risk of repeating myself, here's what's at stake with the Senate race. Democrats winning these races means $2,000 stimulus checks for all eligible Americans. It means decriminalizing marijuana. It means expanding healthcare. It means raising the minimum wage. It means protections for voting rights. It means bold, aggressive climate change protections. Tangible, impactful changes. And the Republican strategy? Here's Kelly Loeffler summing up her agenda.
The Democrats want to fundamentally change America, and the agent of change is my opponent, radical liberal Raphael Warnock. My opponent, radical liberal Raphael Warnock. 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 Radical liberal Raphael Warnock is a socialist. Radical liberal Raphael Warnock. Radical liberal Raphael Warnock. Radical liberal Raphael Warnock. Radical liberal Raphael Warnock. Radical liberal Raphael Warnock is their agent of change.
That's the whole platform. Vote for us because those guys are radicals. Right. The Democrats are radicals. Not the party currently lining up behind a coup to keep a president in office despite losing the last election by 7 million votes and an electoral college margin of 306 to 232. No, that party's totally fine. It's the party that's trying to make sure people have health care during a pandemic that's radical. Got it. So let me just say before we end that if I'm lucky enough to be reaching anyone in the state of Georgia, or if anyone watching has friends or family or anyone there who hasn't yet voted, please do your part and reach out and make sure those ballots are cast for Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. It's not just about sending a message to the GOP that this authoritarian fever dream has consequences. It's about helping ourselves. And now more than ever, we need it. To listen to my interview with former South Carolina Senate candidate Jamie Harrison, who's been on the campaign trail for Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock in Georgia, and who can speak firsthand about whether this messaging is finally coming through ahead of Tuesday's election and what the turnout is looking like so far, check out the interviews playlist on my YouTube channel. That's it for this episode. Happy New Year, and here's to hoping that I come to you next time with 2 more Democratic senators from Georgia.